final session of the Digital Technology Conference this year. I'm going to get on to what we're going to be doing in a moment. We're just going to let people enter into the room, get in with us, get comfortable, wherever you're sat in an office or at home or in your kitchen or wherever. We just need you to be sitting comfortably. I can't believe actually that this has been 5 days now, and we are on the final presenter seminar session of the week. We still do have our speed networking session at 12:45, so please don't miss it. It is a great lot of fun. Please get involved with the Hoover app, enter the competitions, go and see the speakers, go and see the exhibitions, enter the competitions, lots of great prizes to be won. So please make sure you go and do that. And then once we've done our speed networking at 12:45, we're going to come back at 1:15 because, as I said, this is the final day this year of our Digital Technology Conference sponsored by Cognisoft. And we're going to have your reflections, takeaways, our kind of feedback, any things you've enjoyed, any things you haven't enjoyed. So when we do all this again next year, we've learned from the experience. And there's going to be lots to chat about and lots to digest, as it were. Each session across the week has been recorded. So if you do want to remain anonymous, clearly keep your camera off, but also you can go into the settings to change your name on the visible tile as you join into Zoom. So let's do that if you want to do that. So we're going to proceed now with the, as I say, the final seminar within the Digital Technology Conference this year. I'm really pleased to tell you that we've been joined by Andy Durnham, who's the Executive Vice President of the Global Business Unit at Emsi Burning Glass UK, and Will Cookson, who is the Director of Economic Development. I think actually he's got a different job title now, which I think will come up on the first slide. So I do apologize for that. They keep moving people around. But we've got a director and a vice president here, whichever way round that is. So I'm really, really excited to see them. Will and Andy are going to be addressing the post-pandemic economic bounce back and what this could mean for the employability sector, exploring how this might influence how employability providers can shape their activities to meet a fast-changing employment and hiring environment. So, without further ado, over to you, Andy. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Pleasure to be here and great to see everyone. Actually, you'll find it's Executive Vice President, Scott, just saying. But Will absolutely is a director, but no, absolute pleasure to be here. I had an enjoyable time this time, well, last year, where we contributed as well. So hopefully a valuable session to build on that. Joined by Will Cookson, as mentioned. So Will leads our work in the world of economic development and employability. And I'm sure you can introduce yourself properly in due course. A word of warning, the postman has yet to arrive at Will Cookson's house. And when the postman does arrive, you may notice a chorus of dogs. So we're just putting that one out early on, but pleasure to be here. So yeah, I lead Emsi Burning Glass's work actually now globally, as following on the recent merger between Emsi and Burning Glass, and running our team that works basically, when I say globally, it means the civilized world, anywhere outside of North America, basically. So that's our work, and we have teams not just here in the UK, but now in Italy and New Zealand, which is particularly fun for meeting times. So yeah, that's good. And our mission at Emsi Burning Glass, if you've not come across us thus far, is really about helping organizations like your organizations that you work for to make better informed decisions as they relate to the labor market. So we are a labor market data organization, and we want to bring that data to you so that you can make decisions that help you and your stakeholders interact with the labor market more effectively. We work across the realms of education, where we're working with education providers to help them understand what employer demand looks like and how skills development can meet that demand. The world of economic development, which is really about regional activity and thinking about supporting regions to understand the skills needs as well as the talent available at them, so that we can ensure that businesses ultimately get the talent that they need to thrive and grow in their business. And so our goal, whilst that's of course a big challenging topic, our goal is to bring as much of the best possible data to bear to help your organizations and other organizations ultimately help your stakeholders to thrive in their economy. So the goal today, in today's session, really, I'm going to take the first part where I'm going to just share some of the latest statistics that we are seeing in the labour market, and we'll run through just some of the headlines there, and then I'm going to invite Will to introduce himself and to then talk a little bit about the work that we're doing already with a number of your organizations, and particularly thinking about how can employability focused organizations respond to this. Before we get going though, I think we'd set up a poll, and this is where I'm going to call on Helen to interject. I think we set up a little poll. We were just interested, obviously there's a lot of noise and has been a lot of talk about challenges in the labour market, particularly around the pandemic and the impacts. There's been a big shifts and changes happening, of which I want to illuminate one or two things today. Just really interesting to just take the pulse of you guys working in that realm as to how you feel things are going. So I think the poll was asking whether you felt that the recovery that we're in now is better than you would have expected, pretty much tracking as might be expected, or perhaps actually the economy is in a worse shape than you might have anticipated at the front end of the pandemic. So Helen, do you have any of those interim results? I'm just interested.
I do. So we had 14% of people who've responded felt that the labour market was recovering as expected. 14% thought the labour market was recovering worse than expected, and 72% are happy to say it's recovering better than they had expected.
Very interesting indeed. And yeah, I must admit, I recall the early days back, February, March time, 2019, a whole lot of doom and gloom and worry as the realities of lockdowns, etc., were coming into view, and it did feel quite dark back then, I have to say, and I'm sure we all felt the same. Of course, as things evolved, it picked up, we saw an improvement, and then returns of lockdown sort of stifled that, but it does certainly feel like things have picked up quite considerably, and so very interesting that others feel that. I mean, we spend our life poring over this kind of data, and so we can look at the data and see that, but it's fascinating. So thanks for sharing your views, and Helen, thank you for your for sharing the detail there. So let's talk then a little bit about what is happening and what's perhaps giving us some of that hope in terms of the labour market. So Will, if you can whiz on to the next slide. So this is a couple of kind of key metrics that we're tracking as we're looking at how the labour market is responding. So let's start with the graph on the left hand side here. So the dark line at the highest point of the graph, that's the official unemployment rate and how that's been tracking since 2007-8 time, and we can see obviously the recession back in 2009, 10, 11, and the recovery from that recession down towards a low point in, as we were just coming into the pandemic. And we can see, of course, the spike tends to be a bit of a lag when it comes to official unemployment statistics. When it comes to tracking the official unemployment rate, which looks at a kind of 8-week window of job seeking before officially notifying as unemployed. And so we see a slight lag from lockdown, but a significant contraction there, and then the unemployment rate whizzing up to north of 5% as we came into the latter parts of 2020, but has continued to now fall quite consistently back. And actually, whilst of course it did feel painful at the time, and obviously a challenge for the individuals who are at the receiving end of this data, it's fascinating to compare it to say the last recession, where we were north of 7.5% and never got anywhere near that. So I think that sort of flags that furlough has done a decent job of managing official unemployment, certainly. But the fascinating thing is that as unemployment has dropped back, and hopefully will continue to do so, we have seen a resurgence in vacancies. So that's the sort of purpley blue line there. And we can see that, again, pre-pandemic, running at a pretty high level, the highest it's been for the period of this graph. And that just dropped off a cliff at the point that lockdown came back in March 2019. Employers just stopped hiring. But we've seen a steady rise since then. And actually, as we've started to see a route out of the pandemic and easing, vacancies have picked up to extraordinary levels. There's a massive amount of demand now from employers to fill those vacancies. And we'll put some color on that in a moment. The green line there is the redundancy rate. So these are redundancies that are tracked by the Office for National Statistics. And we did see, of course, that spike at the front end of the pandemic as companies were preparing to cut workforce. And that, of course, will have fed into the unemployment rate, but that fell back really quickly as well. So what we're seeing really is short, sharp jolts, and actually coming to a position where we're coming out of the recession in surprisingly good shape, thinking at the aggregate level for sure. The graph on the right-hand side, known as a beverage curve, and I put this in to try and pretend that I'm actually quite clever, but this is actually coming from our economist Duncan, who is the real brains of this outfit. This looks at the tracking of the relationship between unemployment and vacancy rates, and typically what you'd find, and you can see the pre-pandemic, so the green the green route into recession, and then the dark route out of recession pre-COVID. Shows the typical trajectory you head on, that when vacancy rates increase, unemployment falls, and vice versa. This pandemic has, being somewhat artificially enforced, has created quite a different and strange element to the chart, which is the purpley blue, dark blue line, where, of course, we saw vacancies drop off a cliff instantly upon the lockdowns coming in. But actually, unemployment took a little while to start to rise after that. So it was just sort of a hold as we are for the time being, before then redundancies and unemployment started to kick in. We saw unemployment growing, but actually the economy was at the same time opening back up again. So we were going almost in the opposite direction to normal, which has been fascinating. And now we're seeing vacancies spike and unemployment falling slightly, but it's all about timing here. It's just all happening so quickly. And that's part of the challenge, is trying to work out how we respond as these dynamics are changing so rapidly. So that's kind of the headline of what's happening in our economy right now. And using the latest official statistics, we can now sort of start to dig into some of the constituent parts and put some more color on that. So, Will, if we shoot off to the next slide. So I'd mentioned that the furlough, or the coronavirus job retention scheme, as it's officially known, has probably done a really solid job in holding and suppressing the unemployment figures as they stand right now. And of course, the nature of that has shown that we've held employees firm, and in the hope that the economy would pick back up quickly, which it has, and therefore there would be room for people to move straight back into without that kind of significant financial disruption. And we saw, of course, a spike right at the beginning of furlough as employers managed through a lockdown period, and we headed towards around about 9 million employments on furlough, which then eased as the first lockdown eased, picked back up again as we moved into that kind of pre-Christmas lockdown, but has steadily fallen month on month since then as our economy has opened up more. And we're now running at around about 1.5 million employments on furlough. Still a sizable amount, But if we think about the vacancies, significant opportunities as well out there. I think now that we head into this includes July's data. And as we move into this phase, of course, employer contributions increase. And so there was a lot of speculation as to whether furlough would disappear and unemployment would suddenly spike. We're seeing employers still holding people onto furlough, even though they're having to pay more. So it probably does resonate that jobs are returning, and maybe it's just a case of getting people back in. I think there is still some medical elements to this for people who have traditionally shielded, etc., that employers are willing to help them ease back in. There must also be, in all honesty, perhaps a degree of creative accounting happening maybe in places. And so interesting to understand how much of this really is people on furlough, or have people found other jobs but maintained their furlough elsewhere. So obviously not long before the scheme unwinds completely, and so it will only be then that we see the relationship between furlough and unemployment as that scheme disappears. But the main thing is we're significantly lower in volumes than we were right at the beginning, and certainly in the second peak there. So furlough has certainly helped us, and it's been a good scheme. Of course, it's cost us a lot of money as a country, and that's another thing that we have to work through, but we'll save that for another time, I think. But actually, whilst the big picture is positive, it does hide some underlying challenges. And on the next slide, we actually start to look at the sectors that are driving the take-up of furlough. And the traditional sectors that really have driven furlough have been these three on the left-hand side, for obvious reasons, based on the rules of lockdown. So accommodation and food services, the arts and leisure, and other services, which would include things like hairdressing and salons, etc. So they were very much at the brunt of the restrictions, and have been leading the way in terms of where the furlough take-up has been greatest. We still have around about 15% of employments in those industries still on furlough, yet we can see at the other end of the scale a number of sectors that have next to nothing now, realistically, in locked up in furlough. So what we are seeing is a very much a sector-specific challenge now as we resolve this. I think interesting to look at construction, transportation, manufacturing. When you look at the early days, the initial lockdown, that was high, but I think investments would be made in those industries to allow them to work safely under social distancing rules that meant actually there wasn't that fell back relatively quickly. So so an interesting trend there for us to consider. The average is now running at around about 5%, which is the red line. So on to the next slide, and then thinking about the employer demand side of things. So as we saw with the vacancies data, things have really picked up. And on this slide, we're now digging into Emsi Burning Glass's job posting data here that allows us to track online job adverts. And volume terms, we can see pre-pandemic, there are around about 1.5 million unique postings per month advertised by employers, online job adverts. And at the point that lockdown came, March, and then mostly into April and beyond, that dropped off to something like about half the normal volume of job postings, slowly eased its way back. So mirroring that vacancies data to the point now that in the spring, we pretty much had got back to pre-pandemic levels, and we have just shot on well beyond to unprecedented levels. There is a massive amount of employer demand out there. So, clearly lots of opportunity, but again, that opportunity isn't necessarily uniform. There are some variations in that. So on the next slide, we can actually look geographically. So I've just linked this through, given the nature of today's community that we're talking with, looking at the contract package areas for the Restart program and aggregating regions together there. And what we can see is that whilst the UK average comparison of February to August, where we saw the significant recent growth period, nearly doubling across the UK as a whole, actually what we see is regionally that's quite a mixed picture. So we've got some regions like Wales, Southwest, Manchester, a little bit Northeast and Scotland, and some of the Midland areas showing above average growth, and other regions struggling. London in particular is still really struggling in terms of employer demand. Now, some of that is really about work from home. I think employers that would traditionally have recruited into London and expected commuting are looking quite differently. And so maybe some of London's demand is now starting to find its way being spread and distributed more equally around the country. And London has been a bit of an anomaly throughout all of this. Often historically, when it comes to things like recessions, etc., London fares quite well. Ironically, I think London has really struggled, particularly with commuting and of course the tourism, the reliance on tourism there as well for a number of industries. So we are seeing still some quite significant variations around the country. And of course, as you dive into even more granular parts, different parts of London, different parts of their home counties in different regions, you'll see even greater variation. Next one, please, William. And also, it's not generically growth across all roles. We are seeing quite significant drivers to more recent growth as some of the industries have reawakened and reopened, that were put on ice, so to speak, through lockdown periods. So I've just shown occupations that have shown a minimum of 200% growth in volume of job postings by occupation. So this is significant growth anyway. So even vehicle valeters and cleaners growing at 200%. But we look at the extreme end, and very extreme end of growth, we can see really it's that opening up of the hospitality, leisure and retail, and some travel as well, coming through, and other services. So real strong, that growth is really strong right now as that piece of the economy reopens, and new staff are required as well. So some interesting growth there. I think actually this leads me to my sort of concluding remark, which is something doesn't quite compute here, because we saw that furlough is still running at 15% in those industries that are also showing massive demand for workers. So there's something slightly amiss here that we need to work through. And I think this illuminates the great challenge of the fact that, yes, the economy is now really reawakening and booming, but it's reawakening perhaps in slightly different ways than we entered the pandemic, or the pandemic has materially changed things about the world of work that means we can't return necessarily to what we knew before. I think if we think about that, and I think hospitality is the real good example. Furlough running at 15%, so there's still thousands of people being paid not to work in hospitality by definition, and yet employers are going out at scale to recruit. So there's something amiss there. Now, I know a lot of people will have picked up on discussions about Brexit, for example, and that probably has some effect. I would actually hazard a guess that actually it's more a case of travel restrictions being more limiting than Brexit necessary, because actually, technically speaking, folks of European, native Europeans working in the UK previously have right to work in the UK, and may have gone home with quite an existential crisis, of health crisis on the border, and may have not then been able to return back, or have chosen not to. But I do think there's a lot of choice being exercised now, particularly on the worker side, there's no lack of demand, and yet that demand isn't being met. And we're hearing the same about HGV drivers right now in the news. And I think it's something similar there, that there's a lot there's a lot of people actually now using the experience of the last year and a half to question, well, what work do I want to do, and what's good work? And good work isn't just always about good pay. And hearing anecdotally a lot of the conversations about HGV drivers is that there are more than enough qualified HGV drivers in the UK to meet that demand, and yet they're choosing not to. And yes, pay is increasing, but a lot of people anecdotally are saying it's not about the pay, it's more about the lifestyle and the conditions. And I want to be with my family, I want to be with my pets, I want more of a stable life, or a more balanced life. And so I think there is a big shift happening culturally and socially that we need to help employers work through. That there is talent, there are skills out there. How do we make sure those skills are aligned to where the needs are? But how do we also think as employers about the working conditions that we have previously expected and happily progressed on with a solid flow of labor? And as that tap gets turned off, how can we respond to that? So I just wanted to leave that as sort of a thinking point. It'd be fascinating, certainly as we conclude, to hear what you guys are picking up on the ground, so to speak. We're largely looking at the data and triangulating the data points, but connecting that with what we're hearing anecdotally in the media. So hopefully that's been a helpful view. But I do share the optimism that you clearly share, that we are responding really quickly, and almost the challenge has shifted to one of how do we meet this insatiable employer demand for workers in a really tight labor market. And I have to say, the work that you do, particularly if you think about the work we do with marginal, typically people seeking work that have historically had barriers to that work, perhaps imposed by employers. Maybe we need to encourage employers to think differently about how they can access talent, whether that's the ex-offender community, people with disabilities, etc., etc. So I think there's a lot of talent and skills available, and where there's a labor shortage, hopefully we can encourage people to think differently about how they access that labor. And I encourage you to get on that bandwagon that I know you push so hard. So thanks for your work on that. Will, I'm going to hand over to you now to sort of translate some of this into more practical and useful information for our audience today.
Thanks, Andy. That was really interesting to look at how things have tracked and where we are currently, and coming back to those particular challenges that employers are facing around recruitment. Feels like it's exactly a nice lead into what I want to discuss today. Really what we're going to look at in my session, I should probably introduce myself as well. I'm Will Cookson, Director for Government and Communities. Essentially, I lead on our work with local government and also central government, but then also with welfare to work organisations, careers organisations, and a few other different players. And I'll talk about a bit about that, because what I wanted to do was really bring some feedback in regards to how our network is using labour market information to respond to these times that we find ourselves in. And there's a broad range of customers that we have, so quite a broad explanation of how different organisations are responding, and how they're also using labour market data to help them. So I thought I'd start with describing local government, local enterprise partnerships, and the new players in this world, chambers of commerce. Fair bit of change has happened in this world. We've seen chambers of commerce being awarded, I think there were 8 of the skills improvement plans These are trailblazer schemes where it's putting chambers of commerce right in the middle of skills planning activity, which was previously and continues to be led by local enterprise partnerships. So that's quite interesting. That came out of the skills white paper. So yeah, a lot going on, and I think obviously the thing just on the horizon is a comprehensive spending review in November. So that's the kind of context, and it's really looking at how those organisations are going to react or respond to this kind of post-pandemic landscape. I know from our customers and conversations with them, there's been a lot of revising of strategic plans, and there was obviously pre-pandemic a real focus on two things really. One was levelling up, which was just, I think I went to a conference just before, it was early March, probably the last conference I went to, and it was almost at the point of a bingo count of how many times levelling up got mentioned. I think I got to about 32 and stopped counting. But yeah, still very much a focus in terms of policy, and still some big questions of how that actually comes into practice. But yeah, we're seeing revising of strategic plans and a move probably away from the localization of industrial strategies. Still very much a focus on where to best direct funding. And I'd say that's the central use for this audience in terms of labour market data. How do we use that evidence to decide where we're best off putting in place an intervention, and what funding should that intervention have, and who should it be targeting? And that might be a sectoral focus, or it might be about particular groupings of occupations or particular audiences. We know, for example, that young people have been particularly affected by all of this, the unemployment and the obviously the impact of the pandemic. Yeah, so in short, the focus is still on influencing skills and employability provision. They're still very much keen to understand how, going back to what Andy just shared, very much keen to understand and to brief their organisations and their stakeholders in regards to how recovery is tracking. And we've seen that real focus in terms of the labour market information that we provide, that real focus on how important job postings has been in order to understand that. And I'll come back to that point. Moving on, in terms of the world of education, it's slightly different in terms of how their focus has obviously been in terms of operationally adapting the way in which they deliver their services in a kind of, particularly in a lockdown environment. But essentially they will use labour market information in a slightly different way to the local government and local enterprise partnership use case. They'll tend to focus on candidate engagement, almost using labour market information in order to particularly attract candidates towards vocational courses. You do this course and it leads to this career, and this career is growing and continues to grow, and the salaries are X, Y, and Z. And then the flip side of that is that labour market data is very much part of their annual process of planning their curriculum. We see that a lot with our further education customers, but we're also seeing that with the universities that we work with. The bit in the middle there is the careers activity. How do you describe careers opportunities with bringing a really localized view of the labour market and where there's likely to be growth and decline. And that is absolutely key as well, and something we continue to champion. And then to welfare to work. It's been really interesting. As I should probably mention, I had a background and worked in welfare to work and around employment and skills for many years. And I've seen a real change probably just prior to the announcement of the Restart programme. But the use case in terms of labour market information, and I remember doing this myself, was you would use labour market information, probably at a reasonably high level, to describe an area in regards to your business development activity. You were bidding to deliver a programme in an area. You wanted to describe that area and show your understanding of that area to the funding body. And so you did that by using labour market information. We're way beyond that now, which is really refreshing and exciting. We're now moved clearly onto how to use labour market information to direct operational activity. And I think we've seen lots of ways in which customers in the welfare to work space have done that. And I'll come on to that. I don't want to spoil everything. I've got some interesting points around best practice that I want to share. But I think that change from it being a business development use case to an operational use case is really telling. Obviously, one of the ways in which it comes right back to kind of brass tacks. Obviously, you can use job postings data to identify employer activity and which employers are recruiting to which roles on the ground. And there are some useful indicators there as well to start to unpick whether those employers are struggling to recruit. Going back to the point that Andy was making there around some of those hospitality roles, that comes through within the labour market information as well. There are indicators of whether an employer may need some additional support with bringing talent into their organisation, which I think is obviously places organisations that are using that information in a very nice place. I'm going to continue with this particular audience. One of the ways in which I've talked broadly about it moving from that business development use case to operational, it's about taking labour market information and boiling it down and summarising it in a way in which it can inform careers and employment decisions that your customer group are making. Now, there's probably some nuance to this as well, and you saw some of it in the data that Andy shared. We have very granular data that we provide to our customers where they can get down to a local authority level and they could get down to the nth degree in terms of a particular occupation, let's say bricklayers, and we could look specifically at which industry is employing those bricklayers. And that's great, but it tends to be that best practice is to look at a slightly higher level. Granular in terms of occupations potentially, but probably thinking in terms of growth or decline at a sectoral level. And we saw that in Andy's slides. We were talking about hospitality, we were talking about construction, we were talking about retail, rather than those more granular descriptions that are also available. We've also seen our customers in this space using labour market information to engage stakeholders. So either sharing their take and understanding of a particular geography, and obviously we looked at those contract package areas. I'd say it tends to be that our customers seem to focus and go towards LEP geographies, because to be honest, those contract package areas are very big and they contain multiple different economies. So yeah, engaging stakeholders, and when I talk about stakeholders, I'm talking about engaging with local enterprise partnerships, with local government, local authorities, but also obviously Job Centre Plus, and then there's obviously the voluntary sector as well. So and let's not forget as well, stakeholders would also include supply chains as well, who may not have access to the same data. So providing that across supply chain is really powerful in of itself. The other thing that's come out as a recurring theme is looking at skills transferability. We can look at, we're using data, we can look at occupations, we can look at the skills associated with those occupations, the skills, knowledge, experience, and we can see how compatible one occupation will be with another occupation. Obviously, with the disruption that we've seen in the labour market, that's really powerful. So I'm going to just summarise some of the best practice that we've seen in the sector. And specifically, I'm talking here about the welfare to work customer base that we work with. Seen them building data analysis expertise. That means that we've got people, and this is great from our perspective, we've got people within those organisations that are taking a real lead on understanding the data and how that data is then communicated, be it internally to those operational teams, out to their supply chain, or to those stakeholders. And there's different ways in which you'd serve up that labour market data to those different audiences. We're also seeing regular communication of labour market information. Important to say, the structural data, the kind of big picture job numbers, changes. We update that data twice a year, but the really interesting view, and which we would refer to as real-time data, is the job postings, where you can see that tracking monthly. And that's really what we've seen. Is we've seen this particular audience of welfare to work providers move towards using job postings as a really clear way of describing how economic recovery is tracking, where there seems to be growth in terms of jobs. And then what they'll do is they'll bring the structural data to describe the grow or decline year on year of particular sectors. And we can see that in national trends, but we can also look at that at a local level. The use of research reports is really interesting, focusing in usually on a hot topic. I've seen proposals to use labour market information to look at wage discrepancy, which I think is a key issue when you think of the challenges that Andy was setting out there around HGV drivers, around people coming off furlough, people considering their options, but wage discrepancy feels like it's something that would be very key to the employers that you're working with, and being able to have a meaningful conversation about not just salary, but also the broader conditions and the offer that surrounds the job that they are promoting seems to be a really useful conversation to have. As I mentioned, tailoring labour market information for frontline operational use, pitching that at the right level so that no one wants to wade through, well, we might do, myself and Andy, but most people don't want to wade through piles and piles of labour market information. They want it served up in a way in which it can be easily absorbed and tracked with probably a monthly frequency would be best practice. I've mentioned some of these, but I think embedding labour market information across the supply chain is a really powerful thing for a prime provider to do. I think it's also, I think you can really unify stakeholders and supply chain around a particular evidence base, which I think in itself will have benefits in terms of ensuring that really the direction of travel is clear and that activity can be coordinated across those multiple players. I've also seen some of our customers bring careers-focused labour market information to through tools. Essentially, we provide a tool called Career Coach, and that has been purchased in order or invested in to be used across the organisation's direct delivery, but also across their supply chain. And the value in that goes back to that same point that we were looking at earlier on when we were looking at contract package areas. Every area is different. And then if you take it down to a local enterprise partnership geography and you break a region up into those kind of patches, again, the differences will really come through. And so we're always really adamant that the value in careers information and how that's provided, that should also be localized. Salaries vary, job opportunities vary, and that obviously needs to be part of that decision around employment. We've also seen labour market information being used essentially to adapt interventions. That could be everything from employability courses to employer engagement activity, to marketing activity, in terms of how you engage with stakeholders as well. But I think what's interesting is it gives organisations, and they've been empowered to respond to those changes in the labour market as they are happening. And it provides an evidence base that can be used to make some really quite big decisions of, do we focus in and engage with this particular sector? Seems to be that it's growing, seems to be a real need there and a pickup in terms of recruitment activity. So I think that fluidity and that ability to adapt quickly to changing times is really important. That brings to an end my section, but we have got a Q&A section. So I'm going to bring Andy back and just see whether we've had any questions.
So at this stage, as will often happens when people are paying really good attention, we've not had any questions yet, but they will come in.
Yes.
So let's give everyone a moment too. So it's completely up to the group whether you want to pop something in the chat, or if you do want to pop your hand up, I can unmute and you can put your questions.
I guarantee you Scott Parkin will have it.
Yes, it's up already.
Yeah.
See, Andy, you know, because you're a veteran of these sessions. So Scott.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the marvelous ridicule as well, because I've always got a question about the data, because I mean fundamentally this is not my bag. I mean, I don't get it. That's why we have experts like Andy and Will to tell us how it is. But I am interested in terms of the traditional kind of routeways and the challenges that you think. So traditional routeways out of being a job seeker and getting back into employment have been through other large-scale employment programs, employability programs, the likes of hospitality and service sector and retail and places like that. And we know a lot of those sectors have been hit hard before the COVID pandemic, and then a lot of them have been clearly restricted in terms of coming back into that area. So how do you think those kind of traditional areas of what are deemed low skill work, which clearly they're not, but deemed as low skill work, are going to enable people to get back to work? And how much of a challenge do you think it is when those traditional routeways are not necessarily available in the volume that they have been in past recession recoveries for those providers in the market that are actually having to get people back to work quickly through Restart and other program interventions? Very long question, but I think you understand what I mean.
I think it's fascinating, because I remember as the pandemic was unfolding, Scott, you and I were talking about the crisis of how is the sector going to respond when the traditional routeways are the ones that are being throttled. Yet I think as we look at the world opening up, they're really going back strong. So I think those traditional routeways to some extent are there right now. And as you saw in the data about some of the kind of the retail hospitality type roles, as I say, there's something that doesn't quite compute with the fact there's still plenty of furlough yet employers are struggling to hire. But my sense would be a lot of people who are maybe still on furlough are working elsewhere and therefore not able to return or are hedging their bets. I'm not sure. So I think some of the conversation that we had right at the beginning actually is moot, in the sense that world is opening up, and a lot of people are talking about how Brexit is probably manifesting employer challenge to find talent. So to some extent, I think it's probably not a lot different to previous times. The question will be whether how employers adapt if they really do struggle to recruit into those spaces or find what they deem to be viable employees for those roles. Because one sense is that we've talked a lot about automation in the labor market in the past, and that sort of to some extent has been ramped up a little bit, you know. So when you've looked at what was in terms of jobs that were in high demand throughout the pandemic and never really, if anything, just increased rather than declined, was a lot of tech and automation type skilled labor. And so the question is, are we going to see a different world after this immediate shock, as the world settles down, that says retail and hospitality can survive with a lower throughput of employees in due course? But it seems right now employers are just seeking any kind of bodies right now to get into the workforce. So I hope as a short term, maybe there is massive opportunity. My question would be how viable and sustainable that opportunity is. So great to think of that as an opportunity, as a stepping stone, but is it a destination? Probably not, because I think employers are going to have to get used to not having a throughput of pretty low cost, low responsibility hiring from mass European migration, and actually thinking about a workforce they need to invest in if they want to keep.
It's interesting though, Andy, isn't it? Because I remember some statistics that you published a couple of months ago about the growth in wages for low and middle skilled workers, and obviously high skilled workers, there was not the growth in the market at all in terms of wage inflation, but actually at low and middle end there was. And I mean, I always took that probably wrongly as a direct result of you know, capacity not being filled. You know, it was a real problem. But I think the one thing I will want to say, particularly within the hospitality sector, we've just formed a strategic partnership with the Institute for Hospitality, and the main point about that is to, whilst organisations delivering Restart programme and a number of other programmes, Work in Health and JES, have really good employer connections. What we thought was, let's tackle some of the challenge and really understand what the sector requires, in essence, and let's make sure that if people are recruited into that sector, A, it's the sector that they want to work in, B, they're getting a fair deal and being paid reasonably, C, they continue to want to do it, and D, most importantly, they have the right skills for that point in time within the sector. So it doesn't become so transactional and just a kind of a transient kind of process. It actually becomes something that, you know, and is right from the beginning, is something that somebody really wants to do. Because I think one of the key risk factors with program delivery at the moment is there is pressure on one hand to support people effectively to move into work, but there's also the pressure then to fundamentally make sure, both moral and commercially, the pressure to make sure that it is the right job first time. And so in essence, you know, there's a real problem there when employers have such a disparate kind of view between supply and demand, and you know, inevitably they will be looking to fill holes with bodies, for want of a better term, and that's not good for anybody in the widest economic sense, and also from a service delivery and participant point of view.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I hope what I mentioned about that, it feels like there is a bit of a social and cultural shift happening about how we think about work. We all think about work at all levels. And I suppose mostly it feels extreme on the employee side. And of course, the employees hold all the aces right now. Whereas it was only a few months ago that employers held the aces. It switched really quickly. But that cultural shift has to be met in the middle, as you say, and we've got to think about good work. I do think, you know, that it is interesting looking at the wages, and the fact is, you know, wages are disproportionately higher at the high end and have retained pretty much as they have been tracking, but that hasn't been a killer market. It's been flowing throughout the pandemic, no problem. I think it's the low middle scale that is interesting, and for me, that's probably just a making up for lost time. Those wages have been artificially suppressed for a long time, and now some sense of practical reality is re-emerging. But it's there's so much more to it than simply the data. I appreciate that there's a lot of people involved here, and it's a fascinating case study that we should keep a close eye on for the coming 6-12 months as the world returns to hopefully some sense of whatever normal might be.
Thank you, Andy, for that response. And not to steal Helen's fury, we'd only have a couple of minutes left, so I would value your questions and your comments, because, and I mean this with the utmost respect to Will and Andy, we don't normally have geeks in this kind of data geeks, and it's a great opportunity to ask them anything. They have such a wealth of information and knowledge to their fingertips, and if they'd have it to hand, I'm sure they'd be more than prepared to provide it after the session through the Hoover app, as we can still continue to engage through that. So Helen, do we have anything at all that people want to ask? I mean, it's often the challenge with these sessions with Emsi and Burning Glass, isn't it? Because, or Emsi Burning Glass, sorry, that it's so well produced and so data driven that it answers all the questions really, in essence, and then poses much larger questions that no one can possibly answer because they're hugely philosophical. Sorry, Helen.
It is, and there was a big standout for me last year when we were looking at the layout, and I know I've spoke to Andy a few times about this, but looking at how you test the data, because there can be differences, and it was a regional thing, the Derby thing. Go back and watch it, people, if you weren't there. The Derby question stood out for me. We have a question from Liz, and she says, in terms of the new situation, is there any difference between men and women?
That's a good question.
Yeah, and to be horribly hedging, we haven't yet got to the level of detail in the data that can really back a whole host up. You can look. There are clearly certain roles that tend to have a greater have gender divides, and a lot of their I think a lot of the roles that have stood up throughout the pandemic and not being affected have tended to be what one might consider the slightly more male-oriented roles in terms of tech, engineering, construction, etc. And it's maybe you know, on another level, retail, hospitality, etc. That I think when you look at the data tend to be slightly more female dominated, the ones that have been impacted. That said, health and care have remained highly strong throughout, which again tends to have a female dominance when you look at it in black and white terms of the data. I think probably the fascinating question is, will this change those predominances, because they've been pretty much set in stone for a long time. You know, tech has been dominated by males, you know, care and hospitality and retail dominated by females. Will there be a shift as this cultural shift runs through and as employers think differently? And that's my challenge, is employers need to think differently about what their talent looks like and not put barriers to that, whether they be gender barriers, ability and disability barriers, those sorts of things. So great question, Liz, and I think probably it's going to take us a little while to see whether there's a structural shift has happened, but what we have seen is that certain roles have clearly been more impactful than others, that might be typically impacting female employment or male employment in different areas. That was the longest non-answer in the world, wasn't it?
It was very good. But I'm afraid that's all we've got time for now. So I'm going to hand back over to Scott, but just remind everyone, as I'm sure he will, that the chat and the polls and the questions will stay live over the coming weeks on Hoover, so people can go in and interact as more of the data comes to light.
Thank you, Helen. Let's be honest, two wonderfully brilliant and very personable data geeks we've had today from Emsi Burning Glass. So thank you very much, and I always love that, the interaction and the insights and the intellect that you bring to these sessions. I find the whole process fascinating, and as you say, the data argument is being won absolutely across the sector at this moment in time, probably genuinely for the first time ever, and I think it's really important that we continue that trajectory. In terms of continuing on, that was our final seminar for the Digital Technology Conference this so virtual round of applause to everyone. It's been absolutely marvelous, but we're not done yet. There are competitions on the app There's the exhibition stands. There is a speed networking session in about 15 minutes time, which is just the greatest fun you can have at this point in time on a Friday afternoon. I assure you. And then we're all going to come back together at 1:15 and share our reflections and talk about what we've learned and what potentially we could have done, what we could do less about, and various different things, because that learning is really important. Like, we are a learning institute, that's the point. And so in essence, we want to do that. And talking about learning, finally, just a few headlines coming up. On the 29th of September, continuing our live Learn Lunch series, our series of webinars at 12 o'clock on a Wednesday lunchtime, we have White Rose Training, and they're going to talk about the what, how, when, and why of reflective practice, which will be really, really interesting. On the 6th of October, we have Evolve Training talking about brain fitness, relationships, and learned helpfulness. I'm intrigued to know what that means in its sense. On the 13th of October, we have the RNIB talking about seeing opportunities, accessibility, and sight loss. And then on the 20th of October, we have our partners Mesmer talking about an introduction to business improvement techniques. So lots and lots of great stuff. And that's not the end of it, by the way. We have webinars running through Christmas to the new, I can't believe am I the first person to mention Christmas? That's terrible. At least I didn't mention Brexit this time around. But anyway, I left that to Andy, that's fine. So through Christmas into the new year, just to keep you engaged, learning, developing as individuals and as a sector. Suffice to say, thank you very much to all our speakers this week. It's been absolutely phenomenal. We'll talk about reflections at 1:15. But for now, thank you very much to Andy and Will for an excellent presentation as usual. And I will see you all very soon.